We have an aging prison population. Older people in prison are increasing at a more rapid rate than the general population. But caring for people in prison and people leaving prison runs up against societal biases, negative stereotypes. And we have the opportunity in our ministries to help our communities rethink the impulse to lock people up and to keep them locked up as a response to all crime. That's our opportunity. More prisons do not equal a safer society. And the popular narrative that says, once a criminal, always a criminal, just does not square with the gospel that motivates all of our organizations. Fear and a lack of personal experience with people in prison or people leaving prison often motivate and confirm these damaging stereotypes. The gospel, on the other hand, clearly encourages us in a different direction, to respond to people in prison and leaving prison with compassion and with hope, and to believe in the possibility of new life for them and for us. As a spiritual director once told me, God saves us not as individuals, but in bunches. In a speech to pastoral cares in prisons, Pope Francis recently said, "It is easier to oppress people than to raise them." And I'd say it's more convenient too. Today, our societies are called to overcome the stigma of those who have made a mistake. We have grown accustomed to weeding them out rather than thinking about how to strive to help them return to the love of God in their life. Most of us also believe that everyone deserves a second chance. It's an acknowledgement that we're all flawed and that any one action, whether good or bad, should not determine who we are forever. As a pastoral carer who works at St. Vincent's in St. Augustine's told me, we are not our worst mistakes. And part of what I do in my pastoral care is to share that good news with the people I meet. Research tells us that many people who experience imprisonment come from socially and economically marginalized communities. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are significantly overrepresented. It also shows that, and this is a quote, not only is Australia's prison population growing over time, but older prisoners over 45 are a growing proportion of Australia's prison population, and the population of older prisoners is growing at a faster rate than the population of younger prisoners. But there is limited research evidence on what happens as older people leave prison in Australia. This is a group of people at high risk of falling through the cracks of our health, aged care, and social services, and the panel that we have here today is going to talk to us about some of the challenges and opportunities before us with respect to this group of people in our country. So the first person I'd like to introduce to you is Katja Issa. And Issa, as many of you may know, is in the Arabic world the word for Jesus. And Katja translates Issa as God's girl. So we are very lucky to have Katja here with us today. In fact, I call Park Lee Katja's place because you walk in, absolutely everybody knows her. So I'd like to introduce you to Katja. She is the operations manager of St. Vincent's Correctional Health at the Park Lee Correctional Center here in New South Wales. From her frontline perspective, Katja will be setting the scene for us today, sharing her experiences of the reality of aging in correctional settings and helping us to understand the issues faced by older people in prison and telling us about a few opportunities we have in caring for our aging prison population. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning. I pay my respects to the custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to those who are here in the room today, and a good morning to all of you. Park Lee is a maximum security remand centre and is home today to 1,200 men. Sprawling over 584 square metres, it is a sizable landmass to traverse, delivering health care to custodial patients who, for an array of reasons, present to custody from community with significantly complex and high health care needs, often unmet or unattended in the community. Incarceration is steadily on the rise in Australia. It is my observation that in recent times, people appearing before the courts are more likely to have a period of imprisonment served upon them by the presiding judge or magistrate, rather than a diversion into therapeutic, restorative or rehabilitative support. And this clearly does not include people with an indictable offence. This low tolerance for diversion correlates to increasing community expectations regarding the management of crime and punishment by our elected officials. Tighter bail laws, changes to policy and legislation that mandate prison sentences for certain crimes, making it harder to get parole and ruling out suspended sentences. So let's consider the data. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, elderly is defined as anyone over the age of 60. Interestingly, academics and researchers of the criminal justice system define elderly as commencing at 50 plus. According to the ABS 2023 Prisoners in Australia report, we currently have some 42,000 people incarcerated across Australia. 2,343 people are aged 60. If we break that down further, 2,259 are male, 84 are female. In New South Wales, we have 863 males and 26 females. At Parklea, over the last 5 years, we have received into custody the highest number of newly arrested people. That's across all of New South Wales. Over 650 newly arrested men arrive at Parklea every month. So in the last year alone, that's a total of over 7,300 men. In the past year, a total of 16,000 custodial patients moved through Parklea Correctional Centre. Today, there are 34 men aged over 60 residing at Parklea. So who are the aged in custody? The reason for incarceration is often very different for men and women. The incarceration of women is often linked to family circumstances, mostly domestic violence, and the physical and psychological toll this takes on women. Older males tend to fall into several categories. The first time in custody, this often refers to men who have committed sex offences. Ageing repeat offenders are usually men convicted of petty theft with a history of multi-generational trauma and illicit drug use and alcohol dependence. People who grow old serving a long sentence are traditionally men convicted of murder or heinous crimes. And people serving a shorter sentence later in life are often people on fraud charges, insurance, tax, etc. What the reality of ageing in a correctional centre looks like. I'm going to focus on Parklea. The ageing process is accelerated by approximately 10 years in prison, as the majority of people who end up in prison are already in poor health due to leading lives involving poor diet, lack of medical care, and substance use. And of course, because prison environments escalate age-related illnesses. Healthcare provision to the elderly is often challenging, particularly in a fast-moving remand centre like Parklea, where centre operations flow rapidly with volumes of people transferring in and out and people not staying generally more than for 40 days. The centre routine follows a strict structure that involves a head count of all custodial patients 3 times a day. Elderly people find the strict adherence to this routine tough, especially if they have a chronic health condition, have decreased mobility, live with chronic decline of a health condition, or experience incontinence issues. Shuffling to make the queue slows the process down, which increases tensions in the centre. The physical prison environment and architecture make prisons dangerous in more ways than one. Parklea is all about uneven surfaces, long distances between destinations, bunk beds, and many, many stairs. Unexpected arrests are accompanied by unexpected costs for people because people come into custody with no medication, none of their mobility aids, hearing devices, continence aids, CPAP machines, or glasses. This creates additional work for staff who are often working backwards to ensure access to these necessities with the purpose of ensuring patients are comfortable and residing in dignity. So we'll move on to talk a little bit about the vulnerability and victimisation of elderly custodial patients. Those who are perceived as frail, disabled, or with poor mobility are susceptible to targeted, unwanted attention, bullying and standover tactics. It is not uncommon to hear that a patient has been paying protection money or paying for care by other inmates to literally survive prison life. Of course, being robbed of personal belongings by other more aggressive and violent inmates or being hurt by a cellmate for being too loud because you snore are all too common occurrences in prison. A larger number of custodial patients are sex offenders, and they are the most vulnerable to victimisation and violence because of their offences. Prison code very much does exist, and sex offenders tend to be the most despised by other inmates. Moving on to healthcare. It often feels like you are working backwards, and I think I said this previously, providing healthcare to the elderly in a remand centre. By the time a patient is received into custody, they are often at the end stage of disease or their chronic condition is beyond reverse of disease. In very practical terms, there is literally no time for preventative health intervention or opportunities to discuss advanced care directives or voluntary assisted dying. This often creates clinical and ethical frustrations for the treating healthcare team, who can readily track the progression of circumstances and the opportunities for early intervention and where they lay before someone lands in our care. Cognitive impairment has led to many elderly people's incarceration. The criminalisation of cognitive impairment exacerbates the frustration of the treating health team because it feels like we've learnt very little from the criminalisation of mental health, and yet it is interesting that the number of people entering custody of all ages with cognitive and neurological health challenges is on the rise. Imagine arresting a 65-year-old with dementia and Tourette's for repeatedly touching himself in public, or a 92-year-old for assaulting a police officer in a state of confusion. Often the healthcare team are unable to approach dysregulated patients upon initial admission because they are so confused and frightened. Patients are likely to lash out at staff, and so the option is to wait. It's psychologically challenging for staff witnessing patients in decline through cambered cells and being able to help as a patient paces confused and ranting, waiting for his energy to fade before a safe entry into the cell can be assured. Healthcare of the elderly requires a balance of practicality and humanity. In custodial environments, for a healthcare practitioner, it is incumbent upon us all to take this approach. The St Vincent's team is mindful of the heinous crimes that many elderly men have committed. But in simple terms, we have to trust that the justice system is doing its job. Providing good patient care requires a strength of character that admits judgment of the patient, and that's our job. So what are the opportunities for St Vincent's? Advocacy. Advocacy for alternative pathways where appropriate other than arrest. This could be legislative or through social policy change. Sentencing reform advocacy is also another consideration for us, particularly for those incarcerated due to the intellectual disability or neurological compromise. This also needs to consider changes to parole and early release legislation. Specialised aged care accommodation, including but not limited to custodial aged care facilities, aged care wings in correctional centres, and particularly with a focus on aged care programs. The fourth option is to consider what role does St Vincent's play in transitioning people to release and community service provision. So I'll conclude with this. Arrested in 1962 as South Africa's apartheid regime intensified its brutal campaign against political opponents, 44-year-old lawyer and African National Congress activist Nelson Mandela had no idea that he would spend the next 27 years in jail. Nelson Mandela spent a total of 10,052 days in incarceration. Nelson Mandela was 71 years old when he left custody. And he left us with this: no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katya. Thank you. That was a great description of the way that aging prisoners are especially vulnerable in our prisons, and also the example of the 92-year-old man in confusion being held in remand for assault, just the way in which the criminal justice system misrecognizes health problems.
Yes.
Thank you. That was really powerful. Now I'm very excited to welcome our next guest. Our next guest is Andrew Padiachi. Did I pronounce that correctly?
That's correct.
We are so excited to have you here, Andrew. Thank you for being with us here today. Andrew is going to share his lived experience with us of the prison setting. Andrew works as a senior peer worker for Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health Network in New South Wales. He's going to share his reflections on aging and aged care for people in prison from his perspective, firstly, as a person who has been incarcerated, and also in his current capacity working for Justice Health. And we'll do this in an interview style. So can we start off with some of your background? Can you tell us some of your personal background and how you came to work in your current role?
Absolutely. So 2019 was a very hard year for me. I was arrested in South Australia and subsequently held on remand because I was a New South Wales resident. That meant I had to spend an amount of time in prison before my charges were dropped. And subsequently, the movement through the prison system in South Australia through to a forensic psychiatric facility as well. I spent 8 months in total in the system. 3 months into that prison visit, my charges were dropped. But that meant I had to wait for a court date before I could be released. So a further 5 months I spent within a psychiatric facility in South Australia, waiting for a court date to arrive. Being from another state, being from New South Wales, it was quite hard for my family to visit. It was quite hard to understand a service or a system that was very unfamiliar to me. Skip forward 8 months in 2019, I was released on September 26th. And during my stay in some of the psychiatric facilities that I was shuffled around in, I met a peer worker, which subsequently led to me developing my skills and my lived experience to go and pursue a career in forensic mental health as a peer worker and currently as a senior peer worker. My role has led me to inspire hope and inspiration to all patients in a facility that I work in here in Sydney through my lived experience and sharing of my experience of services of system that may help someone in their own day-to-day life and manage it better. So the facility that I work in is a 135-bed facility made up of adolescents, women's unit and 4 male acute units. Personally, I do have the biggest workload within that hospital where I know and attend to and care and provide hope and inspiration to all 135 patients, which is a capacity load for that hospital. I've been doing it this year for 5 years and I've achieved a lot of personal growth from having the exposure as an employee, albeit a government employee, into the system that once housed me or a similar system that once housed me. A lot of the inspiration that I can provide to people is that it's not all smoke and mirrors when it comes to a justice system or correction system, but the reality of leaving the system to some is very scary, particularly to an aged population, but I'm living proof that it can be done and that I am able to share that hope and inspiration via the work that I do with the people that I provide care and advocacy for.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.
From your experience, can you tell us what are some of the challenges that older prisoners face, especially prisoners that are facing terminal illness, diagnosis? What are some of the obstacles that they experience?
Some of the first thoughts that come to mind with the patients that I've cared for, particularly in a situation where, for one instance, one gentleman was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He didn't get to see his family because he was held involuntarily for so long before he was released back into the community with some subsequent care and support around him. And within 2 to 3 weeks of being released back into the community, from having already served 25 years in a prison setting, to come to a rehabilitation forensic hospital after serving a sentence and being diagnosed while in that psychiatric hospital with a terminal illness, that added a further 4 to 5 years to that gentleman's stay in involuntary care or incarceration on top of a sentence and parole period already served. That particular gentleman did go back to reside in his family home and sadly passed away 3 weeks after he was released. During that time, his family were interstate within New South Wales and found it very difficult to visit and be with this particular patient and have the contact that they needed to support him around his passing. The other side of aged care, particularly in our system where people are diagnosed with terminal illness on top of a mental illness, on top of a physical illness as well, means that the care is divided between a multidisciplinary team within the hospital that relies on external services and stakeholders to make sure that care can be delivered in such a way that it is consistent with the care that someone of a terminal illness deserves. Sometimes that coordination between services isn't there as prevalent as what it could be, and what I mean by that is that the time frames that someone's hospital appointment is booked and allowed a patient to travel to externally from a prison or psychiatric facility may not be as timely as what you and I are privy to out in the community, where we can go to a doctor at the call that we make or an appointment that we make. There is sometimes months in advance bookings that are made for services that don't show up for people that are in a prison system or are overbooked for those people in a prison system. And an example of that is for someone, for example, who needs glasses just to read or to make sense of the words in front of them. The service is booked months in advance, usually gets overbooked. A optometrist does show up, sees a number of patients on a number of units, may not get to every patient, and then leaves the hospital the same day. It's not an in-house service in a psychiatric facility, whereas many public hospitals do have in-house services. We rely on the external services that are there, which make it very challenging for the security aspect as well, shifting someone between facility to service in a humane sort of manner. From a corrections service, I've been personally handcuffed to a wheelchair and ankle cuffed to a wheelchair to go and have a brain scan in a South Australian public hospital. That was very humiliating to be in that situation, knowing that I was in prison greens at the time and had to face public from a restricted form of access. Those sorts of things make it difficult for an aged care person or an aged person in a facility, as that mobility may not be the easiest thing for someone to get into a van physically, be handcuffed or mechanically restrained, and then ushered through a public hospital in a way that the focus is on you as a stigmatisation or representation of the community that is marginalised, but often seen as a prisoner. That can take away the really human aspect of why services that we have are harder for an aged population. The other side of that question is what I can see in an aged population in a prison setting is that some people are accustomed and become dependent on the system to survive, knowing that they don't have anything to go out into the community for, no means to support themselves properly, and in some cases people are released after serving such a number of years in prison with very little resources to rely on and no information or understanding of how society works after 20 years. Part of my role as a peer worker does allow some sort of therapeutic care on occasion and compassionate leave to help introduce our aged population who are being reintegrated back into the community with a little bit of help and support that they need. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. Such a rich description of the way in which the construction of the system is not only inefficient oftentimes, leading to the exacerbation of health problems, but also humiliating for persons. Thank you. What could healthcare look like for people housed in prison? What could it be like? What could we do?
From my experience, what is being done in prisons and psychiatric facilities, not just in New South Wales, but where I've experienced life, the areas that could be done better is really understanding the older population's dignity versus risk, their profile of re-entering society and how much that dignity versus risk comes into play. I think as part of a health service, reintegrating an aged population back into the community can only reach so far before it enters the community's hands to help support an aged population. With the dignity versus risk aspect, when someone is committed to a psychiatric facility under the Act Proven but Not Criminally Responsible Act, they are there not for punishment, they are there for rehabilitation. And that rehabilitation should continue throughout their journey of recovery well into the community. And that's where recovery happens best, is in the community for everyone. How we can do that better is that the services and systems that talk to each other to allow that reintegration to happen need to be a bit more streamlined, a bit more open and transparent. I think the example of a person leaving a facility, albeit a forensic facility, back to the community, has a team of support organising every aspect of someone's care if it's going into a SIL, supported independent living environment. Once we as a team are engaged, people like social workers start the process of trying to find a SIL that won't discriminate for someone that has been in a prison or corrective services system or a forensic system, and then has the ability to provide the services that are ongoing that have shaped this person's chance to be rehabilitated and end up back in the community. Without that continued support, the service that we provide becomes obsolete and non-existent once a person leaves, and it ends up in the hands of people like yourselves today who have the opportunity to make that transition and completion of a reintegration a smoother transition. And sometimes an email sent by a social worker or an MDT member to an external stakeholder or provider in someone's care may not be attended to in a certain amount of time that correlates with the release pending an MHRT review or tribunal review to allow that integration to happen smoothly and in a timely manner. By the time the information gets converged between both parties and a tribunal hearing is heard, that could add another 6 months onto someone's stay unnecessarily, which for someone who's aged and terminally unwell as well, could mean that their length of stay is just prolonged just by red tape, which we could cut in so many different ways.
Thank you. You've touched on this already. The last question I want to ask you. So many people here work in or alongside aged care services, and you've talked about the importance of the reach into community and supporting people after they leave prison in community. What would you like to see aged care services do to help people in that transition leaving prison?
Absolutely, and I see it a bit already in the service that we have, where we have NGOs and CMOs that we do engage with that are transitioning people back into the community in conjunction with services from corrections and the justice health side of things. So one example would be we have a person who has served quite a lengthy stay in a prison environment, and he's being transitioned out directly into the community from the forensic facility that that he's housed in at the moment. The CMOs that are engaged at the moment were the last resort for this gentleman to reach a point of reintegration into the community. What that meant was that we, as a service, approached a number of organisations and explained the unique circumstances of this gentleman to correlate the organisation of his reintegration with corrections, the CMO and the Justice Service together, so that everyone was satisfied that there was enough risk profile that is low and dignity that is allowed for this gentleman to start the reintegration process. What that meant was that corrections weren't happy unless there was some sort of monitoring service on this gentleman. What the forensic side of things said was that he's able to be rehabilitated. The combination of discussions between corrections and forensics meant that an ankle tag was allowed to be placed on this gentleman. What that meant was, though, he was transitioning out of a forensic service with a CMO, where he was slowly spending a night, increasing to 2 nights, etc., until he's now at a point of almost a week out of the forensic service that he's currently housed in. That ankle bracelet does trigger patience in the forensic service. Just by having a reminder that you are leaving the system, but you are still a part of it in very many ways after so many years. The littlest things that can make life easier is just that communication between services and allowing that dignity over risk for circumstances that allow that to happen, to make way for reintegration for those people who really deserve to grab a hold of who their lives can be and make a go of it in such a way. They've paid their dues, they're flesh and blood just like anyone else, and they do have the ability to engage with, like I mentioned, the CMO that was the only one who accepted this person to reintegrate back into the community. I guess the way we look at the ageing population in that aspect as well is that the services that are out there discriminate against crime that is committed, age, the history of housing for the last however many years a person was incarcerated, and the ability to share a common space with other people, that risk profile. Once we get over a lot of our preconceived ideas about hearing what a prisoner is or what they've committed in terms of crimes, we allow humanisation to be a bit more prevalent in someone's life, and generally in the marginalised population that needs it most. That ageing prison population that doesn't have that support to go back into the community for.
Andrew, thank you so much. And thank you for your work, because you're clearly, in your experiences, you're bringing humanization to the people that you work with. Thank you for sharing that with us. I feel like you've enriched our humanity in sharing your story with us. So please join me in thanking Andrew. What a special treat. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Chris.
Our final speaker, my friend and colleague, Lincoln Hopper, is the CEO of our St. Vincent's Care Services across Australia. Lincoln has been working with St. Vincent's Health Australia since 2018, bringing with him an impressive 28 years of experience in health and community services. His diverse experience includes frontline social work program management, policy and advocacy, fundraising, property development, and leadership. Lincoln, considering the missions of our organizations and the pressures on Australia's prison and healthcare system, is there a current role for Catholic health and aged care organizations to provide care for people serving prison sentences or those leaving prison? What should our response be from our aged care sector? What do you think?
So noting the time, the short answer is yes.
Great.
But probably better question is, what should we do? And I think that's linked to calling and capability. So it's contextual to the organisation, and St Vincent's has a history and depth in this space that is calling us to really look into this. And from my perspective, from an aged care lens, but we've established the case, right? There's a need, a significant one. Over 65s are proportionally higher within the prison system. They actually have a high proportion of life or long-term serious crime sentences. They're ageing faster than the normal population, so a 50-year-old is exhibiting the challenges of a 75-year-old, and they are finding their way to hospital and not anywhere else because of those concerns. So, yes, there's a response, and from a St Vincent's perspective, the Sisters' first act in Ireland was to accompany 2 women in prison for petty crimes who were executed that day. The second day they got off the boat in Australia, they walked into a prison. So I think we're called into that space to accompany those elderly prisoners. And for our response, we're really trying to explore, can that be done within the aged care setting? So can we establish a custodial residential aged care setting for those individuals as they serve out their sentences over their life?
Fantastic. Thank you. So what can we do as a sector sort of to reimagine our response? So the response is absolutely something we should do. We have all the motivation in the world for it. How do we reimagine it given some of the challenges and limitations that Katja and Andrew have told us? What can we do together and as individual organizations to provide support?
Chris, I think this is a coming together of the parts that are involved in that care process. It's complex. It's complicated. We're a year into a process that we haven't even begun yet to try and unpack how this could be possible. But the bringing together of those parts is really what would make all the difference. So the needs of the resident are paramount and cut across a range of domains. So the bringing together the partnerships is probably the most important aspect.
And as we bring together those partnerships, what do you see as the key challenges that we'll face?
Yeah, so within the aged care residential setting, in order to accommodate these prisoners who are serving out their sentence, there's a raft of constraints put on us. They need to be incarcerated, they need to be shackled 24 hours a day, they need to have 24-hour supervision within that care setting, they need to wear certain clothing. Whole range of constraints that we are not for, and in fact are contradictory to what we would suggest is how we would want to care for them. We acknowledge those constraints and yet are compelled to act, and so we need to bring together all of the care that's required for them in that setting and then seek to advocate for change. There's a better way of caring for these individuals who have been deemed unlovable by society. Call to act to them is to support them in that process and in their care, but then to start through a process of change, advocate for policy that will enable less constraining, as one example, for us to be able to care for them with dignity.
Thank you. And that really ties into what Andrew was saying about the humanization, how important it is for us not only to provide services, but also to advocate so that the service can be genuinely human. What do you see as the benefits as we start to make inroads in this space? What do we stand to gain for those we serve?
We know now, Chris, just as these prisoners age in prison and then are going to hospital, they're causing bed block issues within the hospital system.
Yeah.
So there's an immediate benefit that we understand really well as a sector to unlocking that. But the benefit for the individual, the community and their families is immense. These individuals deserve every opportunity like we all do. And the knock-on effect is that and the consequences profound if we can act on their behalf.
Thank you. I think you did that in a really informative and brief way, which
Thanks,
is a talent and a gift. So St. Vincent's, I want to thank everybody, but you especially, Lincoln, after that, but I want to thank everybody at the same time. But St. Vincent's, since the first 5 sisters from Ireland came to Australia, they went to the female factory in Parramatta. It's a part of our history and our DNA, but it's really a part of all of our histories, because this call to care for people in prison and leaving prison comes straight from the gospel. If Jesus gave us a metric about what it means to follow him, it's to care for people in prison and leaving prison. So please join me in thanking you, this amazing panel.
Andrew, thank you for your courage. And to think of Andrew being handcuffed and ankle cuffed and spending 13 months in prison before his charges were dropped is a huge violation of his human rights and dignity. And in 30 years on the road as a reporter, I covered deaths in custody, kicking off with the Black Deaths in Custody Royal Commission. And in my final month at the ABC in 2020, I was covering a coronial inquest into another death in custody. So I had the reputation in ABC News as having been to every prison in New South Wales, so much so I was in holidays in Broome, and this woman said, "You might like to come and see my workplace." And I said, "Oh, where do you work?" And she said, "Oh, I'm at Broome Prison. I'm the warden there." So I've been to a lot of prisons, even in India. And unfortunately, during 30 years on the road, I did witness that explosion, that building boom in New South Wales prisons, and the vulnerability of prisoners, and very important conversation too about constraint, and I look forward to hearing more about aged care, which offers the dignity and compassion, which is the hallmarks of CHA's members. A big round for our panel and the courage and the gratitude we have for you, Andrew.